All right, let's see here. So we're talking about farm and residential petroleum storage tanks, not talking about propane tanks. I'll also throw in there that we do work in Virginia. A lot of this I would assume is going to apply to DC and Maryland as well, but I'm not real familiar with all the kind of the subtleties or intricacies of the regulations in those areas. Just FYI. Okay, so heating oil tanks, farm, residential, and commercial, and then farm and residential motor fuel tanks also. This is what I hope you're going to take away from this. We'll get a little background information on the tanks. So we'll talk about risks. We'll get into the laws and regulations, which, since you're home inspectors, that might be the most important issue for you. Due diligence. How do we protect our clients and ourselves and our companies? Then in the end, we'll get into the economics a little bit, not really specific pricing, although I'm happy to kind of verbally talk about that. But we'll get into the main point of that is the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund. Okay, I'm pretty sure DC does not have a fund. I'm pretty sure Maryland does, but it may operate a little differently. All right, so heating oil became popular kind of after World War II, and it remained a common means of domestic heat until about around 1980. And as you all know, that's kind of when other sources of heat started to become more prevalent. But there are many homes that were constructed before, and this is approximately 1980, that still use heating oil. Okay, and then there's many homes that have transitioned to other sources of heat, but have left an abandoned underground tank. Okay, and as it's going to have a fill pipe. Can you all see my arrow, my pointer while I'm doing this?
We do.
Okay, good. All right, good. So we've got a fill pipe, which normally is flush with the ground, and it usually goes directly down to the tank. And that's very helpful to us because it allows us to measure the bottom of the tank and measure what's in the tank. The vent pipes will usually have some 90-degree bends in them because you want to get them out of the yard and up against the house. Okay, and they'll have that little mushroom cap on them. And then obviously the petroleum has to get to the furnace. So there's usually two copper lines, and they're about 3/8 inch diameter that go to the furnace. I'm only showing one here because they're kind of, right adjacent to each other, but there's usually two, and the fuel will circulate as it uses what it needs. Okay. Here's a fill pipe. This one is sticking up out of the ground, so it's a trip hazard, obviously. But they're about 2 inches in diameter. Vent pipes are kind of a diagnostic feature. They've got that little mushroom cap, and they're usually up against the side of the house. They may extend to the roof line, or they may be about 12 or 18 inches. They're usually about a 1.5 or 2 inch diameter as well. Obviously, the tanks need to be able to breathe as the fuel is being consumed or as fuel is being filled into the tank. The fuel gets to
some of those, John. Do some of those have a whistler in them for when they're filling the tank?
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the vent pipes having a whistle, but they may. But I know that the tanks sometimes will have a whistle, or above ground tanks will have a whistle mounted on top of them. So that kind of makes sense that a vent pipe might have a whistle as well. So the idea would be that when the tank, but the whole point of the whistle is that it cuts off when the fuel gets up into it, when it's filled up. So I'm thinking the whistle would be on the fill pipe. I'm not sure, Hollis.
Okay. Good
question. Yeah. The supply and return lines, sometimes called feed lines. Here's a photo of some that were cut off and crimped. They obviously switched to natural gas or something else. Yeah. But I like this photo because you see the above ground tank and the underground tank, and it's kind of there to emphasize that when you see an above ground tank, it often means that it was a replacement for an underground tank that failed. Okay, but just because an above ground tank was put in, please, don't assume that an underground tank either isn't there, or if there is one there, don't assume that it was properly addressed, because in our experience, it's very frequently and probably even most of the time not properly addressed.
So, John, it's dawning on me that it's dawning on me that your expertise is about finding the leaking ones and removing and replacing them, which is so there may be some question. I'm gonna pose the questions to you, but don't feel embarrassed that if it's outside your area of expertise, because I think you're good at what you do, which is deal with old leaking tanks, not how the new ones work. So the question that just came through from one of our attendees was you made a comment about the vent being over close to the building. Do you know why that is?
It's my understanding is it's just to get it out of the way of any kind of traffic, so it's not a trip hazard.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's the only reason I can think of. I've never really read anything officially about that. And I've got some photos where the vent pipes actually are in the middle of the yard, which just seems like a really bad idea. Okay. All right. Yeah, let's see. We also, farms, we see a lot of motor fuel tanks at farms. So if you do work in rural areas, you might notice some fuel pumps. And they fall under the same unregulated category that the heating oil tanks do, which when I say unregulated, that means there's no regulations that require kind of preventative maintenance. Okay, the regulations that apply to the unregulated tanks are reactive, not proactive. Okay. Here's another residential or farm tank pump just sitting out there. Here's one where you've got a vent and a fill pipe, and they are kind of out in the yard. And again, just seems like a bad idea, just an injury or something waiting to happen. All right, these are a vent and fill. They penetrate the wall there, so they're going to be going to an above ground tank in a crawl space or a basement. Okay. All right, so we've got these tanks. If it's the original tank, they're going to be old. They're going to be probably put in before 1980, so 40, 50, 60 years old. We also do see a lot of replacement tanks that are not going to be as old, okay? But the life expectancy of these tanks is usually about 20 to 40 years. So we do a lot of inspections on underground tanks, and we've accumulated a lot of data over the years, and our data show that about 70% of the tanks that we've inspected exhibit some leakage, a reportable amount of leakage. Okay, if it's the original tank, that's going to get close to 100%, because that original tank is going to have far exceeded its life expectancy. Replacement tanks that are newer, a little lesser percentage. Okay.
But you're saying that the likelihood of a leak, if we know that there's a tank on site, the likelihood of a leak is around 70%.
Correct.
Wow.
Yep. We're usually, if we inspect a tank and it's not leaking, we're usually fairly surprised, to be honest with you. So, yep. All right, here's just so you can visualize. This is a tank that was removed. This tank was put in the 1960s. So, and it was removed probably right around 2000. So 35-year-old tank. Obviously, it's pretty severely corroded. Those holes are along the bottom of the tank. It's been rolled up on its side. Obviously, the holes are highlighted with white paint, but it's just so you can visualize that metal does corrode, but I'm sure I don't need to make that point to home inspectors that metal does corrode. So, all right. So what are the risks? What could possibly
Well, John, before you go on, what about the requirements for abandoned tanks?
Well, I'm happy to answer that now, but I will get to it. You want me to wait? Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's wait.
Yeah. So what are the risks? We'll talk about kind of what can go wrong, and then we'll talk about the regulations and what's required. Okay. So the tank's collapsing, we haven't seen that yet. At least, my company, Pollard Environmental, we have not seen that yet. They are made of metal. It will corrode and ultimately disintegrate, so it is inevitable. Will it cause any problems? All right, that's just for fun. That has nothing to do with an underground oil tank. It's a sinkhole down in Florida, but it's pretty cool. Okay, so the tanks are about 5 or 6 feet in length. They're about 3 or 4 feet in diameter. So you obviously would not see anything like this, but you could expect to see some damage if the ground started settling. So although we have not seen underground storage tanks corroded to the extent that settling is occurring, it is inevitable if left alone, and it will cause problems if there's something above it that would be affected, such as a patio or a driveway, or sometimes we see additions with structural footings that go over the tanks. Okay, so it kind of depends on what's over top of it. All right, so here's just kind of a little visual. In 1960, the tanks are in good shape when they're put in. About 40 years later, they're typically developing holes. The holes are usually along the bottom of the tank. And then sometime in the future, you would expect that metal to completely corrode and disintegrate, and you would expect the ground to settle there, but we haven't seen that yet. What we have seen groundwater get impacted. This is a case, you're looking at a map view, obviously, of a neighborhood. That yellow, or this little star here, was an underground oil tank. It leaked a lot, got on the groundwater, and this yellow area represents the approximate extent of the groundwater contamination, and these red circles are drinking water wells that exhibited petroleum constituents in it. Okay, it's not like you could taste or smell the petroleum coming out of the faucet, but when analyzed, it did have petroleum constituents. So there's a risk to human health there. And this is just a schematic that shows when the tanks leak, the oil does go down. It goes down until it hits something, or until the leakage runs out. But until it hits something, that's usually the water table. When it gets on the water table, then it will move laterally. And if there's something around, such as a drinking water well, it'll impact it. Okay. This was down in the Virginia Beach area. This tank leaked and got into a storm drain and flowed out into a lake there. So you can get some fairly significant environmental impact from them. This one just shows that this tank was in use. So they were using a lot of fuel that never made it to the furnace. So there's a cost to the checkbook there. We see basement sumps getting impacted. If the sump is there, oftentimes it's because there's a shallow water table. And if the tank leaks, it doesn't have far to go until it gets on that groundwater. And then it's just a question of where it's flowing. And if you have a sump that's pumping, it may pull that fuel towards it. So we do see a fair amount of this. So old underground tanks and basement sump systems, not a good combination. This is a basement floor and wall that got impacted from a tank that's on the exterior of that wall. So that masonry kind of absorbed that petroleum. This one, you normally are not going to see surface contamination because, again, when they leak, it goes down. But occasionally you'll have, hydraulic pressure force oil out onto the surface from a fill pipe that's not tight. And that's what happened here.
Do you ever see floating tanks where they get so much rainwater and the tank is empty, it's full of air, and they float to the surface?
Yeah, we've seen them float. It usually happens if a new tank is put in and the ground is real kind of soft and permeable, and the water will get into that excavation area and float a tank. Okay, and then of course there are floods that occur, and you hear stories of tanks floating as well. So it can happen. I will say, in my experience, it's been very rare, but it can happen. And if there are holes in the bottom of the tank, you're probably not going to get that buoyancy. The water's just going to flow into the tank, so you're not going to get that push up. But if there are no holes in the tank, and the tank's empty or low in fuel, you're going to get that buoyancy. Okay.
So are there any materials other than steel? Do they make plastic tanks or fiberglass or anything?
They do. They make them with fiberglass, and you can get plastic or poly coated tanks that supposedly are more corrosion resistant. The price goes up. We just haven't seen a whole lot of fiberglass tanks. Um, I don't know what the pricing is, but they're not as competitive. And usually when you're putting in a tank, that 20 to 30-year window seems to be satisfactory for people that are still using heating oil. So the tanks that still go back to the ground are normally steel tanks. Okay. The regulated tanks that are going into gas stations and that kind of thing, they're going to use fiberglass or corrosion resistant tanks because they have to. Okay, the regulations require them to take proactive steps to make sure that they are corrosion resistant, and also they have kind of bells and whistles leak detection because those are required. Residential and farm tanks do not have those requirements. Okay. All right, so getting to Hollis's question. So what are the rules on these things? I already talked about they don't have those proactive or those preventative regulations. Okay, the regulations are all kind of reactive. And the first one deals with leakage. It's state water control law. And again, we're talking about Virginia here. So the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, they don't care about the tank itself. They're concerned about leakage. So if there is, well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay. The second regulation deals more with the tank itself. That's the Virginia Building and Fire Code. They're concerned about the structural and fire issues associated with the tank and the product. A tank that is not leaking and in use is in compliance with both of these regulations. And these are the only regulations that apply, at least in Virginia. Okay, so it's perfectly compliant to use an underground tank as long as it's not leaking. It's when it's taken out of use or it starts leaking that it's no longer compliant. All right, so what exactly does this environmental law say? It's kind of interesting because if you look at it, you know, it sounds like it's effective, but it really isn't. The first bullet point is it prohibits the discharge of petroleum to the environment. Okay, great. That sounds good. The second one is evidence of a release shall be reported to DEQ immediately. Okay, great. The thing is, though, they're underground and you're not going to see the leakage, at least not normally. Okay, there's not going to be any surface manifestations. You're not going to see dead grass usually. You're not going to see plants dying, trees dying. You're not going to smell it. So this regulation really, it's really an ineffective regulation, and it kind of was designed more, this Article 11 of State Water Control Law was really designed for bulk facility above ground tanks. It just kind of evolved to apply to the unregulated residential and farm tanks. Okay. But in the event that there is evidence of leakage, you do have to report to the DEQ, and then the DEQ has the legal authority to require corrective action as needed to protect human health and the environment. Okay, so that's the environmental regulation. One issue that comes up, because a lot of times these are real estate transactions that you're working on, is that you know, who's going to be responsible if there's leakage? Because, you know, I may own the tank today and Hollis may own it tomorrow. Well, it's pretty simple. The Department of Environmental Quality just says whoever owns it when that release or that leakage is reported to them is the responsible party in perpetuity, okay, regardless of whether it changes hands. So that keeps it nice and simple. And of course, that's why a lot of times people want tanks inspected before they purchase a property, because they realize that if leakage is discovered after they take possession, then they'll be the responsible party.
So you sell it, you're still responsible. You sell the house, you're still responsible for the cleanup.
No, whoever owns it, I'm sorry, yes, that's correct, Hollis. If it's identified before the transaction, then the seller is going to be responsible for it. If it's identified after the transaction, then the buyer is going to be responsible for it.
So if the seller is aware of it, he's obligated to report it, correct?
Correct. That's correct.
And then even if he doesn't report it, as long as it can be proven that he knew about it or should have known about it and failed to report it, he still is the responsible party even after it changes hands.
In theory, that's correct. Yes, but
Okay, so what about the
yeah.
home inspector who becomes aware of the leak? Is that home inspector now obligated to report it?
That's a great question. The regulations say that the uh, owner slash operator is required to report it. So I don't think the home inspector would be required to report it. And our situation is, obviously we're identifying leaking tanks all the time, and we see that gray area of who's responsible for reporting it. And so we want to avoid that gray area. So we always get permission from the owner that in the event that we identify leakage, they are authorizing us to report it to the DEQ. So we normally report it per authorization from the owner. We want to make sure that communication is real clear. Okay. I learned that the hard way from the early years. So,
can I jump in with a question to you, John? Just
sure.
to follow up on that.
Sure.
So as a home inspector trying to protect my client, the buyer, and I see an underground tank, how far can I go? Can I recommend that it be tested for leakage?
That's exactly what we recommend. And I do have a section in here that is the due diligence, and we'll go through that in order, but that is the main point. Do that leakage inspection, because that's the only way you can determine the status of that tank with regard to the regulations, determine, whether it's in compliance or not. Okay, because again, there's no proactive regulations. You have to inspect it. I use, when I'm presenting to realtors, I use the analogy of a home inspector. There's no law that says you have to get a home inspector. You do it for good due diligence, okay, and to make sure that you're not buying any liabilities. It's similar with the underground tanks. You're not compelled by law to investigate those tanks for leakage. It's kind of a little bit of a loophole in those regulations, okay, so you're not compelled to. So it has to be per due diligence. Now, obviously, if there's oil coming out on the surface, or you have an above ground tank that's visibly leaking, then it's kind of a moot point. It's obvious, okay? But if it's underground, you're normally not going to know whether it's leaking. All right, let's look at this second regulation. We just kind of went over that environmental regulation that deals with the leakage. That second regulation of 2 is the building and fire code. Okay, and I say building and fire, they're 2 different codes, but they make it real simple because they both just refer to the same source code, the International Fire Code. And the IFC says that USTs that are taken out of service shall be emptied of all flammable and combustible liquids. So you got to get the fuel out, and then you've either got to remove the tank from the ground, which obviously would necessitate backfilling it, or you can fill the tank with an approved inert solid. There's a cement slurry, foam, sand. Those are all normally approved inert solids. Okay, so you all probably already knew that, but that's what the code says.
Is that at the discretion of the homeowner?
I wouldn't use discretion. It is a code requirement. But you all know there's lots of code requirements that go, undone. Okay. So the way that I explain it is, let's say there was a fire marshal on the site doing an inspection, and he noticed an underground tank that was out of service, then he could compel that homeowner to bring the tank into compliance. And a building inspector, I think, could do the same thing, okay? But that's not normally going to happen. So in a sense, it is kind of an optional or a discretionary thing for the owner of the house. I shouldn't use optional. I like the word discretionary better, okay? But it is a code requirement.
Now, are you going to talk about permit requirements for this?
I talk about that. Yeah, most localities do require a permit when you abandon or remove a tank. Okay, so yeah, I mean, is that all you need to know, Hollis?
Well, I guess I'm remembering the last time you talked, which I heard you, which I think it was at least 10 years ago. But it seemed that the way I recall that you were saying then that there was uh, that removal was preferred, and that actually getting permission to abandon in place was difficult. That sometimes the jurisdictions wouldn't give you permission to do that. They required that it be removed. Is that something has changed, or is my memory failing me, or?
Well, no, it's there. There are some localities, and the city of Richmond is one. They will require that tank to be removed unless there's some obstruction. Because they're the fire marshal, they can do that if they see it as a safety issue. As you all know, the building code is both the minimum and the maximum. So a building official can't say, "Hey, we want it removed," as opposed to filled in place, because the code allows for either. The majority of the localities will let you select either one. Okay. And I think that's true with most of the Northern Virginia localities as well. And I think Spotsylvania is one county that doesn't even require a permit. Okay. So, but most of them do. But yeah, most of them will allow either option. Okay. And it's cheaper to fill a tank normally. So, that's a good reason right there.
But John,
Yep.
there's some of the stuff in the chat. I don't know if you've seen that, but some of these people are pretty experienced who are making these comments about in Maryland.
Okay.
There is a requirement that home inspectors report a known leak.
Okay.
What was the other one that I was asking about? About being about
Permits.
Well, about requiring the removal.
Mhm.
Yeah, so yeah, Nick is saying that in Maryland it's required, the removal is required, and you have to get special permission to abandon it in place.
Okay. I did not know that. I know.
Can I interrupt? This is Mark Lunder.
Uh-huh.
And piggybacking on what Hollis said, and having seen you before, I thought there's a scenario where you have to get permission to, if you're gonna fill the tank and everything and leave it in place, because what they're concerned about is seepage and contamination of the soil. And you can be forced to take the tank out, or they'll come and take the tank out and dig the hole, but you've got the responsibility of filling the hole after they take away the contaminated soil.
And you're speaking about Maryland?
I don't remember what jurisdiction. It just made sense that somebody could come and say, "Hey, the soil, this tank has been leaking.
Not Maryland.
We've contaminated the water. We've got to go ahead and clean this up too."
Okay.
Maryland is that way. My understanding of Maryland is that once a tank has been identified it's leaking, whoever has the knowledge has a 30-minute window to report it. Otherwise, they come after you
Gotcha.
for not reporting it. The current homeowner is on the hook for removal of the tank and removing any contamination as far as it goes. So basically,
Yeah.
the liability is unlimited.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
You used to be able to abandon tanks in place, as I've heard the discussions. It used to be you could go to the local fire marshal and get permission to abandon a tank in place. That has become extremely difficult. The only exceptions I've heard is when the oil tank is part of the foundation, where the foundation was either poured around it or removing the tank would structurally undermine the house. Again, it's still up to the fire marshal.
Okay.
He thinks is a big oil spill. You're going to be taking part of the house apart.
Wow, that explains why I get some people that when they this is in Virginia, when they have a leaking tank, it's like, am I gonna have to tear my house down? And I kind of chuckle and say, no, you're not gonna have to move your house, but it sounds like there's something to that. Wow. Okay. Virginia is not like that. They do, and I will talk about the leakage requirements. Okay.
But before you go there, John,
Go ahead.
just to kind of finish up on that, have you ever seen a situation where where removing the tank might affect the structure of a building?
I'm sorry, you're asking me, Hollis, or were you asking?
I'm asking you if have
Yeah.
you ever seen a situation where removing the tank might affect the structure of a building?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's the foundation that you're concerned about. So if it's a budding or or even underneath the foundation, we see that where people have built an addition. The original footprint of the house is not going to be over the top of a tank, but if someone puts an addition on, a lot of times that footing may go over top of the tank. So we do see that. In those cases, we're going to fill that tank with a cement slurry, flowable fill, basically. Okay, we're not gonna. Yeah, that description of what's going on in Maryland, that's never been the case as long as I've been working in Virginia. Okay, but I don't want to de-emphasize the contamination. Let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so I'm trying to present this as two separate regulations. You've got that regulation that deals with the leakage, and you've got the regulation that deals with the tank. Okay, and that distinction will come into play a little bit when we talk about financial assistance, though. Okay, but obviously when you're dealing with a tank that's leaking, both of those regulations come into play. You've got to address the leakage, but you've also got to address the code compliance. Okay, now I said a little while ago that you're not compelled to inspect that tank for leakage. That's a gray area in Virginia as well, okay, because the building code does not require that. So you can abandon a tank legally in Virginia without doing a leakage inspection. Okay, now when it's the fire code, the fire marshal that's handling it, the fire prevention division that's handling it for that locality, they do have the authority to require more than that minimum code. Okay, so what we find is that when the fire marshals are handling it, they can and very often will require a leakage inspection. Okay, and we always recommend a leakage inspection even if it's not required, because we feel like that's the most important thing. And because if there is leakage, there's a cost-effective way to address that, to protect human health and the environment. So we don't see a reason not to do that. Okay, so we're kind of gonna get into that a little bit right now, but I'll just show you a couple photos. This is just a tank uncovered, being cleaned out. That could be either filled with an inert solid or removed. That just gives you a scale, a visual scale. Again, they're usually about 4 feet, 3 or 4 feet in diameter, 5 or 6 feet in length. Okay. All right. So
What is
getting
it,
to
500 gallons?
they're usually 300 or 500. Yeah. And we do see some that are 1,000, and we've seen some that are greater than 1,000. If it's a big old house, sometimes they'll have 1,000-gallon or 1,500 or even 2,000-gallon tanks, but they're the exception. All right, so let's kind of look at how do we protect ourselves, and then we'll talk about the environmental remediation and the financial assistance. Okay, so here's the due diligence process, and I sent Hollis, I emailed you a fact sheet that kind of has all this stuff on it for anybody that's interested. So this is again for Virginia. The first item, have a proper leakage inspection performed. Okay, that's your compliance inspection. That tells you what you have with regard to the two regulations. And then after that, everything kind of flows naturally. If it's leaked, we'll address it per the regulation that deals with leakage. If it's leaking or out of use, address it per the building and fire code, the regulation that deals with, out of use tanks. Obviously, if it's an active heating system, you've got to make arrangements for, repair or replace that heating system and then restore the site. So this is just the due diligence that we've always recommended. It's been on our fact sheet for 20 years and we've never had any issues with it. So it's survived the test of time in Virginia. I can't emphasize that enough. And I apologize to the Maryland folks. I probably need to do a little bit more research in Maryland so I can be more help up there. But right now, just not able to do that. The leakage inspection.
I'll make that fact sheet available on the website where people can just log in and download it.
Okay, appreciate it.
Yep.
The leakage or the compliance inspection, it's pretty simple. We're really just trying to get some soil from around the bottom of the tank, and you can smell it and tell whether it's leaking. But we do get the soil samples analyzed at a lab that gives us a third party, and it gives us a quantification of that. We have learned over time that those borings need to be at each end of the tank, and they need to be close to the tank. You can't just do a boring in the general vicinity of the tank, because when they leak, that leakage goes down. Okay, so you got to try to intersect that area. Okay. Usually we'll use a hand auger to do that. We do have a geoprobe for some situations, and sometimes it gets to be a fairly complex issue. All right, there's no inspector certification in Virginia. We don't have
Hey, John, before you go under,
Yeah.
were you going to talk about cost?
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Okay, good.
Yep. Yeah. There is no.
Also, wait a minute. What about pressure testing?
We don't really do pressure testing or recommend pressure testing for residential or farm tanks. We felt like that if you do that and you get a fail, you're going to do further testing anyway. And we feel like if you do that and don't get a fail, that it's not conclusive. It's kind of based on experience and stories that we've heard. So I don't have any scientific evidence of that. We've just never been comfortable with that. Okay. All right. So we don't have like an ASHI organization for quality control for tank inspectors or anything like that. So there is no certification. We just recommend that inspectors have experience, insurance, and have some kind of certification, whether it's geologist, soil scientist, or at least a contractor's license. So we use the word qualified inspector. All right, so let's get into cost. And this also this kind of or implicates the whole cleanup thing, okay? And what kind of remediation is necessary. So I'll go ahead and tell you what we charge for a standard compliance inspection in Northern Virginia. We charge $550, and that's probably in the ballpark for most. Okay. The Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund is really awesome. Virginia runs it very, very well. It was established in the late 80s. The money comes from us, whenever we fuel up at the gas station or get a delivery of fuel. You're paying a little bit indirectly into the state fund. It gets about $20 to $30 million a year for the state of Virginia, which is, not a whole lot for the whole state. And what the fund is intended to do and does do is it provides financial assistance for DEQ required, and I bolded the DEQ required environmental corrective action after a financial responsibility of $500 is met. And then it covers it up to $1 million. Okay. The Department of Environmental Quality is the state agency that's responsible for ensuring the safety and, human health and I'm sorry, ensuring protection of human health and the environment from petroleum releases. So when there is a release, we report it to the DEQ. Then the ball is in their court to determine what corrective action is necessary. And we want it to be in their court because when they tell us what corrective action they want, they're going to pay for costs over $500 for that. Okay. And so it's sort of self-regulating because they have, they have limited finances to do these things. So it's going to be risk-based on what that environmental corrective action. It's not like Maryland. Virginia is perfectly content with allowing some contamination to remain underground. Their theory is that nature will take care of a certain amount of petroleum, okay? But there's some levels that nature can't take care of, in which case they will want remediation. But the process normally goes like this. The first step will be abatement and a risk assessment. So they'll want to stop the leak. So we remove the oil from the tank, usually with the vacuum truck. And then we do a risk assessment. We do additional borings to determine how deep that contamination goes and whether it poses a risk. Pertinent information is, are there any drinking water wells nearby? Is there a basement nearby? Is there surface water nearby? Is there something nearby that could be impacted? If the risk appears low, based on that data, the DEQ will close that case and let nature take care of it. Okay.
So who is doing this? Is that you're doing that, or is DEQ doing that?
Well, the Department of Environmental Quality is making the requirements. Pollard Environmental, for one of our clients, is performing those requirements. Okay, so they make the decisions, and we, as the consultant and contractor, comply with those requirements. We do the work. They tell us what to do, and we do the work.
Now, how many have you seen where the cleanup was over $1 million?
I have not seen any, not for any residential or farm tanks.
What's the biggest? What do you think is the biggest one you've ever seen?
About $300,000 or $400,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. When the groundwater gets impacted and you get drinking water wells, that can obviously increase the price a lot. We also get ones where there's a lot of petroleum on the groundwater, and we excavate a lot of soils, and that can cause the price to go up very quickly. So, yep, that's a good question. All right, so again, it's risk-based. They'll allow contamination to remain as long as it doesn't pose a risk to human health or the environment. It sounds like it contrasts significantly with Maryland. I've never had a situation where we had to remove a structure to remove contamination. By structure, I mean some kind of building. Well, obviously a driveway, sidewalk, patio, sure, but no building structures. Okay, and that's good and bad. It could be bad for the environment because there might be impacts from that down the road. But the DEQ just, again, it's risk based. Okay, all right. So let's see. Now let's look at what exactly does that. Oh, let me back up. So I talked about that risk assessment. Okay, I would say often, probably even usually, that risk assessment shows that the risk is low, because usually if it's a residential heating oil tank, they took it out of service in 1985 because they converted to a heat pump, and so there was 50 gallons left in it. It rusted out, and 50 gallons got into the ground, and a lot of it's kind of naturally biodegraded over time, and that's just not something that needs to be cleaned up. The DEQ is not willing to put the resources into that. Okay, so the case gets closed. But there are some where the risk is high, either because the contamination is severe or extensive, or because there's something nearby, such as a well or a basement, that either has been impacted or is at risk of being impacted. And so then the DEQ will require remediation, which means let's go in there, let's try to excavate it, get it cleaned up as best we can. Okay. Sometimes that's adequate. Sometimes we have to do groundwater remediation if it gets deep down into the groundwater. Okay. So some of these cases do go on for a long period of time. Sometimes we've got cases that we're handling that have been going on for more than a decade. Okay. And those are the ones that can get expensive. Okay. But again, that's what that financial responsibility is. I mean, that's what that financial assistance is there for. All right, let's talk about what does this funding cover, and maybe more importantly, what does it not cover? And then we can talk about what might be some good budget estimates to take care of these things, you know, total out-of-pocket budget estimates. All right, so let's remember that the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund is for environmental corrective action to address the leakage. It's not for the building and fire code compliance. It limits the owner's exposure to potentially high cleanup costs, and it provides for alternative water supply if necessary. So if a well is at risk or a well is impacted, the fund will cover the cost for a new drinking water well or to hook up to municipal water if that's available. Okay, if there's no other solutions, then they'll put a filtration system on the well water. Okay, what the fund does not cover, it does not cover building and fire code compliance costs. Okay, filling or removal of a tank, unless the removal is necessary as part of the cleanup work. Okay. So if we've got to remediate and excavate soils, the DEQ will say, well, technically we don't pay for code compliance, tank removals that is, but obviously to get that soil out, we've got to remove that tank. So it in effect becomes part of the environmental corrective action process. So in that case, it would be covered under the fund. Filling a tank in place is never going to be covered by the fund because that's not environmental compliance, or that's not environmental corrective action. That is just strictly code compliance. Okay. The fund also does not protect against third-party lawsuits. So if my tank leaked and impacted a neighbor's well, the fund is going to make sure that that neighbor has clean drinking water, a new well, whatever it takes. Okay. But if that neighbor wanted to sue me because they felt like they had been harmed, either their health was harmed or for some reason, then the fund is not going to protect me in that case. Homeowners insurance may protect me in those situations. All right, so costs. Again, the tank fund does not cover code compliance costs. And I have to emphasize this because I teach this class often to realtors, and their takeaway is my exposure is $500. So I have to really emphasize that the tank does not cover code compliance costs unless the contamination is severe, and the tank must be removed to enable excavation of contaminated soils from beneath the tank, which is actually pretty rare in Virginia. Usually, unless there's a well nearby, usually they'll let nature take care of it unless it's really severe. Okay. And again, the tank fund never covers costs to decommission a tank in place by filling with an inert solid. So we tell people, budget in the Northern Virginia area, budget about $5,000. That's maybe $6,000. That's going to be normally your worst case scenario. That covers costs for an inspection. It covers the $500 financial responsibility if there's leakage, and it covers code compliance costs. $5,000 would cover a fill in place. If it has to be removed, then you're looking at more like $6,000. Okay. And I'm talking about tanks that are 500 gallons or less, or 600 gallons or less. There are exceptions, again, because we do run into some tanks that are larger, but they're the exception. Okay. I'll go ahead and kind of do just a final summary, and then I'm happy to stay in the meeting and answer as many questions as you guys have. But the summary goes like this. most original heating oil tanks are leaking just simply because they're going to be at least 40, 45 years old, and probably more like 55 or 60 years old. And the metal was just not designed to last that long. It was designed to last about 20 to 30 years, maybe 40 if it was a good quality steel. Okay, so most original heating oil tanks, and I would say a good number of the replacement tanks are leaking as we speak. And because Virginia does not have these proactive regulations, they're just leaking, again, as we speak, potentially impacting the groundwater. And that, I won't go off on that whole environmental issue, but it is a concern, for our future environment. Risks, okay, there are risks associated with leaking tanks, and there are risks associated with just old abandoned tanks. And there are also rules or regulations. There's two: one that deals with the leakage, that state water control law, the environmental regulation deals with the leakage, and then the building and fire code deals with the tank itself, the structural issues of that tank. Because of the risks and because of these rules, and because these tanks are unregulated or exempted from those proactive or maintenance regulations, we highly recommend due diligence. And the most important part of the due diligence is to do that release or that compliance or that leak inspection, whatever you want to call it, okay, to see what you've got, to determine the status of that tank with regard to these two regulations. Okay, and then that Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund is really good in Virginia because it limits that homeowner's exposure. I say it's really good because, again, it does limit that homeowner's exposure. But I also think about Maryland, and I think because they don't have that fund, people are going to be more proactive, and they're going to, heating oil tanks are going to be, people are going to be really, really careful about having one, and they're going to monitor it because they're concerned about those costs. And that is better for the environment. In Virginia, yeah, it's great that we've got the fund, but it also gives people a false sense of security. And those tanks sit there and they get neglected. The groundwater in Virginia, frankly, is being degraded as a result of that. Okay. So that's my presentation. Our website, pollardenvironmental.com, is also a helpful resource. We do have an office in Northern Virginia. It's over in Front Royal. So we cover that area pretty well. And happy to answer the questions.
Yeah, John, we did have one question that we didn't get to.
Okay.
I noticed that you mentioned vacuuming out the residual fuel as part of a cleanup or a mitigation. But what about vacuum testing? I'd never heard of that, but one of the attendees asked about that.
Yeah, I don't have any data on that. Okay, so I can't really back up anything that I'm saying. All I can say is in Virginia, that's not a normal practice for residential or farm tanks. To get a good vacuum, you're going to have to get a good seal on the vent pipe, a good seal on the fill pipe. And I don't know whether it's because the economics of that just make soil borings easier, or because it's not as conclusive. I think from talking to others and just discussions in the industry that it's not real reliable, and that's kind of what I've gone with, but the economics might have a big part in it too. And I also feel like, again, the soil borings, if we do that and we find leakage, we know that there's been a release to the environment, so it goes right into that state fund. Whereas if you get if you fail a vacuum or a pressure test, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a petroleum release to the environment. So you're probably going to follow that up with soil borings anyway. So again, not a scientific or data-driven answer, but that's the best I've got. I am interested from the Maryland folks if that is a common procedure in that area, though. Do you see a lot of pressure or vacuum testing on tanks?
This is Bob from Maryland again. I see Nick jumping in with what I was going to talk about. The person that sort of kind of introduced me to tank testing, Holbrook, out over the Eastern Shore.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
He said, do not pressure test, do not vacuum test. You can damage the tank considerably and still pass the test. He said vacuums are probably the worst because you can draw in water just enough and you won't fail the test, but you've now compromised the tank. Vacuum is worse because it's underground. Pressure test, you're pushing against the side, but if you vacuum even a half a Pascal, the pressure on the tank is many pounds per square foot. It's not designed to take. So Steve was very adamant saying, do not do pressure tests of any kind.
Okay. That's very helpful. I've heard that too. And the theory makes sense. I just never had any data to back that up. I am familiar with Holbrook. I think they'll do a volumetric test where they'll have a standpipe and they'll kind of add fuel and see if it goes up or down, or I guess goes down if there's leakage. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, they put either a sight glass or something on it. Make sure that nothing is drawing or returning oil, especially when we have the 2-pipe systems. And they set it up and they say, we'll see you in 24 to 48 hours.
Gotcha.
And then if it comes back and it's moved at all, you failed.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Good.